Welcome to Finding Hope, the End to Suffering. Hosted by psychologist, author, and co-founder of the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership, Dr. Barry Weinhold, with national radio host, award-winning producer, and inspirational speaker, Patricia Raskin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Raskin, and welcome to this segment of Finding Hope, the End to Suffering. I'm Patricia Raskin, and I'm co-hosting this wonderful program that is Barry Weinhold's creation and brainchild. And Barry, being a psychotherapist, PhD, and having done this work for many decades, and written over 60 books. So he's really the expert. And it was Barry's idea to bring on people who can talk about how they've ended their suffering and found hope. So Barry, I know you have a great guest coming on, George.
Yeah, right. George knows more about film and how to view film than anybody I know. And so every time I talk with George, I learn more about how to really view films. And so we decided we would take 3 films that in the next 3 episodes, and each episode will take one of the 3, and talk about what the film really is trying to tell us, so that we understand it at a deeper level, and can begin to use what I call our mirror neurons to learn, as we identify with the characters in the film, more about how they speak to us and what we can learn from these films about suffering. And each of the episodes take on a different. Hi, George. Each of the episodes will take on a different tone. Like the first one is about kind of what happens to people when they ignore their suffering, or when they don't address it. And so then we'll have a segment or an episode where George will talk about a film where it looked like they were trying to work on their ending their suffering, but they weren't quite getting to the core of the problem, and so it didn't work. And then the final one is one where the film shows the amount of suffering that this young man experienced, and how he was able to work his way through that. And even in the ending, it leaves you a little bit wondering what the outcome will be. But that's good, because you see he had an epiphany at the end, so you know that he's on the right track, and you can imagine now that he's had this epiphany, how he's going to find more and more hope in his life. So George, take it over with the first one and introduce the film, and then we'll hear what you have to say about it.
Thank you, Barry. I love what you and Patricia are doing with this series, and I hope that what we do in the next couple episodes helps people think about these issues. As I said in the last episode, the great movies are often quite complicated and have some ambiguity that makes people argue about them, which is great, of course. Another piece that I'm sure everybody will agree is that, although Barry's right that we have these mirror neurons that allow us to feel for other people, it's also true that our mirror neurons work differently in different people. I have students who can't bear to watch the bloodbaths of Tarantino. You know, you couldn't pay them to watch Kill Bill or Pulp Fiction. And there are other students you couldn't pay to watch Sound of Music. So people's feelings vary a lot. And I'm actually going to think in some of these films, you're going to have some examples of people that people feel very differently about. So and just so you'll know ahead, maybe have a little anticipation, my primary film or story in this episode is Peter Pan, which of course has a number of versions. Then for next episode, the focus will be Hitchcock's movie Rear Window. And the last episode will focus on Barry Jenkins' great 2016 movie Moonlight. So for Peter Pan, people will often say, and I teach a course on this, I've been very interested in this subject for a long time. I dressed up as Peter Pan at age 6. So the wound goes way back in my life. People often are surprised about this. But the more you think about Peter Pan, whether you know the James Barrie originals, and he wrote the play story 4 or 5 versions because he couldn't figure out what it was about. But the more you think about the play, the story, I think you'll begin to understand its issues. Here, for example, my first clip is the Disney Peter Pan. Now, you'll notice he does not exactly look like a 5-year-old. In fact, in the early versions, those drawings that were so popular early in the 19th century, in 20th century, he looked very young. He looked like he was about 5. But in fact, Disney made him older because the issues are that of an older person. In fact, in the Disney movie, Peter Pan is rather marital. His relationship to Tinkerbell is very complex. But so the issues of family and marriage and relationships are very deep in Peter Pan. I think it's very important that the boys, from the films that join Peter in Neverland are the lost boys. And I think at the core of the movie is a study of abandonment. Here's another example of how ambiguous the story was. James Barrie could not decide initially between 2 subtitles for the play. The title that it's published with is Peter Pan, the boy who would not grow up. But he also considered another subtitle, Peter Pan, the boy who could not grow up. And in fact, I have a wonderful journal entry I use sometimes. Barrie wrote later in his life about Peter Pan. He said, long after writing Peter Pan, I've discovered its true meaning, the desperate attempt to grow up, but he can't.
George, let me ask you a question there. Do you think that, can you relate to that, or do you think a lot of people can relate to that? People who grow up and they're in denial and they just keep doing things that they did when they were kids, or they're out there partying and people say, how old is this person? We did that when we were teenagers. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, very much. I think there's a wound in childhood that occurs when children are not loved or not held, and that makes them feel that they don't belong anywhere. And Peter Pan spends his life running away from commitment. And it ends up being, for most of us, very self-destructive if you continue to do that.
Yeah, I just want to, Barry, just comment on that, because that's your work, is people who run away from commitment. I mean, that you spend a lot of time on that.
The big C word. And yeah, there are lots of people who try to kind of skim through life, never committing to anything. And that would be probably a symptom of not growing up, because committing to people and to marriages or to jobs or whatever is part of being a mature, responsible adult. And the biggest thing with the Peter Pan complex, which is what it's called in psychological language, or sometimes called the puer complex, the Jungians talk about that, is that these are people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. That's the main characteristic. Is that, I mean, all of us kind of living in a culture that kind of emphasizes youth, which isn't bad, but the bad part of it is that if we enter that society and think that we're still a teenager and don't have to have any adult responsibilities, then we end up doing things that we regret.
I have to share something here, and it just, what you both said just really helped me realize it. I had a close family member that's no longer with us, and I remember being with that family member, and someone came to dinner, and that person looked at me and said, they're just like Peter Pan. And I didn't understand it until you just explained, kind of like living in that little childlike fantasy world, not really taking a lot of responsibility. And that was interesting. I didn't get it until just now. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the great movies, I think the Disney movie is very good. Also, there's a 2003 live action movie by P.J. Hogan that's brilliant. If you study those movies closely and the original play, what you see is that the Barrie in that shot you showed us is Peter at 13, 14, 15. He's not 5. Peter Pan is very much interested in women and girls. He's very romantic. But he also, look at this shot, he's flirting with mermaids. But he also does not want to be connected to them. So he wants to be Wendy's father. He wants to be Wendy's son. He wants to be connected to the mermaids, but he doesn't want to be connected to them. And so he sends lots of mixed signals to the women in his life. And the fact that he very much is an erotic figure. If you see the P.J. Hogan version, give us the next shot, is this great romantic dance between Oh, that's also Hogan. That's Wendy, who is looking for romantic affection from Hook. But I also have a shot we may get to of Peter and Wendy dancing together. He's very romantic with her, but he also is terrified of that. So it's the double desire. He does really want to be close. He's also terrified of it. And so he ends up sabotaging everything. And part of the problem with the Peter Pan tradition is that people see the end of the movie when Peter flies back to Neverland as a kind of sweet affirmation of childhood. This is really cute. It's very lovely. And in fact, it's tragic. And I think the wish to see this as somehow childhood playfulness triumphing is really troubling. I'm probably got a lot of people mad at me for saying that.
No, what do you think, Barry?
Yeah, I think that rings true for me. And
there you go.
There's the picture of the two of them. Wendy.
If you see the movie, as soon as Wendy says, "Are we going to get together? Are we going to stay together?" This is up in the trees. He starts to sink.
Yeah, right. Because that means commitment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I was interested in, George, is how does this movie impact you personally?
Well, I have very much some of the same abandonment issues. And if you know the play, you know that, particularly that Hogan version, Wendy's father, Mr. Darling, is rather weak. He's very ineffectual. And my own father was also weak. I discovered recently, doing research, that he was actually very much affected by the encephalitis epidemic that swept the world in the early 1920s. 5 million people died. And he came out of that with some brain damage. His sister said he changed completely after the epidemic. And in my family, he was very passive. My sister was bipolar, very violent. He was completely ineffective. And so I ended up being parentified. I had to be my mother's ally in running the family. And so I was taking care of the lost boys in Neverland. And I didn't get a chance to be the child that would have helped me grow up better. So I feel that wound, but I also try not to run away from it.
George, when you saw the movie, did you realize that was your wound too, or no?
Well, I first saw it at 6 in 1953 when it came out, and I was so excited. I went out and dressed. I've got this old picture of me dressed up as Peter Pan for Halloween. Oh my God, I didn't get it at all. In fact, I was very seduced by being the surrogate parent. The way Peter struts around, taking care of the boys. He loves to order them around. I love playing with my dolls, but it was a fake kind of authority. I didn't understand how that authority role, being parentified, was seductive. I didn't realize that for many years.
Yeah. Barry, how do you feel about this, just in terms of the work you do with clients, when sometimes, they don't see it for 30, 40 years?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's been my experience, is that I don't know what it is. I can't predict it always when it's going to happen, but there is that moment when the light bulb goes on and people say, "Oh my God, that's what it's all about." And actually, Piaget described that in his research. He said the way people learn is that when they find something that they're curious about and they try to understand it, they then have to kind of accommodate it with what they already know. They have to take it in and make it fit with what they already have information about, and see if they can make it fit. And then they assimilate it first. They take it in, and then they try to accommodate it. And when they do that, they have this aha moment, which is, he called it equilibration, which is kind of a scientific word for saying, "Aha, I got it."
Yeah. George, where does Captain Hook come into this?
Well, it's an interesting question. You saw the still in one of the things I love about the Hogan film. It's the other film you should see besides Disney. Is that Hogan captures the original casting of the play, which all the plays have followed for years. The same actor plays Mr. Darling and plays Hook. And the movie used in that shot, the shot you saw, it was Jason Isaacs. And Jason Isaacs is Hook in that movie. He might be 38, 39. So he's a young enough guy that he could be a kind of almost a partner for Wendy. And so when she moves to Wendy is very attracted to him, and this is something in the Barry originals. She finds him a version of her father that would work. I mean, her father is so passive and retiring; he doesn't know how to be a father. And you see here, he said, "Oh, Wendy, oh, you poor thing." He says, "Pimple, adolescence is so hard. Pimples are terrible." And he offers, in fact, to have her join the pirate gang, and she's going to tell the stories. She's going to be red-handed Jill. And so Hook is a very curious figure who is treacherous and dangerous, but also very attractive in the play, and in this movie captures that. You don't see that so much in Disney. So the way Hook as this dark self works, is the dark version of the father, is very powerful.
Yeah, Barry, how do you relate that to your clients, your patients, in terms of that dark self coming in, or people like Captain Hook with someone like Wendy?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, a lot of young men, I work mostly with men, and a lot of young men who are very, very sweet men and would make wonderful partners for women, are rebuffed by women. They want somebody who's a little bit on the edge and somebody who's more exciting, you know, in terms of mysterious or maybe even abusive. And so you find that women are attracted to this kind of character that Hook plays in the movie, and it's very interesting. And I know I've counseled a lot of men who are just totally puzzled by that. I mean, they said, I just fell in love with this woman, and I gave her everything I could. I opened my heart to her, and she rejected me. What happened? And it's that hook phenomenon that a lot of women either they're afraid of that, and I think that may be part of it, is that somebody with that much openness and open-heartedness can be somewhat scary to somebody who hasn't really reached that level of open-heartedness themselves. Right. And then they feel that pressure, and they don't want to have to deal with that, so they actually leave those relationships. Yeah. And yet the other thing is that it's very hard sometimes for women who've been abused by men to separate who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Sometimes the bad guys are very seductive, and they promise them all kinds of things, and then they find that they can't follow through. They're again like Peter Pan. When it comes to being responsible for following through, they aren't able to do it.
Right. So George, we're about to close for this segment. Give us a sneak preview of what we're going to talk about when we continue talking about Peter Pan next time. You know, where are we going next?
Well, we're going to move to Hitchcock. I think one link you might think about is repetition. A key part of the Peter Pan myth or the story is that it continues. In Disney and in other versions, people tend to see that as rather sweet. Well, it's going to go on and on. You know, at the end of the play, Wendy's daughter, Margaret, is going to see Peter, and then Margaret's daughter is going to see Peter. And there's the word, this will go on and on as long as children are young, are gay and innocent and heartless. A very, very complicated line. But the continuousness of this is what you've all talked about, that the cycle will continue forever. In the next movie, Rear Window, watch the cycle. These are not young people. It's a relationship, I argue, that's very much sabotaged by the movie. I mean, it's very complicated. People think that it ends happily. I'm convinced it doesn't.
Right. Name of the movie again, George?
Rear Window.
Okay, an old movie and very well known. All right, well, this wraps up this session. We'll be back with George next time, and of course with Barry Weinhold, who is the host of this wonderful program, Finding Hope, the End to Suffering. And I'm Patricia Raskin, the co-host, and we'll be back. We'll be talking about Rear Window with George Butte next week. Bye for now, everybody.
Bye-bye.
This episode was brought to you by the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership. Find out more about these resources at weinholds.org. Dr. Weinhold is the author or co-author of 75 books on psychology, including his latest book, Get Real: The Hazards of Living Out of Your False Self, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. Patricia Raskin is the host of the nationally recognized program, The Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show, and is currently heard on voiceamerica.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. New episodes of Finding Hope, The End to Suffering can be found every Wednesday. If you like the show, please leave a review and give us a rating.